from the world of politics.
Biden and the United States, the U.S. military, is their 911, and they live in a dangerous area. They also know that.
To the world of business.
I do not expect moves of this size to be common. From the perspective of today, either a 50 basis point or a 75 basis point increase seems most likely at our next meeting.
This is Balance of Power with David Westin.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Well, markets are having some second thoughts about the Fed's decision yesterday, and Abigail Doolittle is here to take us through them. So yesterday, it looked like they liked it just fine. Today, they're not so sure.
It is pretty interesting what we have going on. So yesterday, it was almost as though Fed Chair Jay Powell and the FOMC, that they were trying to have their cake and eat it too, because they raised rates the most in decades. But at the same time, Jay Powell said something along the lines of don't expect these 75 basis point hikes to be too common. At that, you had stocks reverse higher, jump higher, in fact, up about 3%, and yields come in. The dollar also came in. What's so interesting, overnight, the dollar stayed down. Right now, we're looking at the DXY down more than 1%. It's worst day since March, the worst 2 days probably also since March. That typically helps risk assets. Overnight, though, yields shot higher, so investors not really believing it. This point, we now have yields believing the dollar, that 2-year yield in, but risk assets, stocks still down about 3%. The question is the initial reaction, that little bit of a risk rally, will that return if the dollar and yields come in? And it looks like yields are going to keep coming in.
So, Abigail, as you look at these markets, how much of it is the market basically saying, oh, they're going to get inflation under control, that's good. Oh, wait a second, in order to do that, we may have to go into a recession.
Yeah, I think that today it's that recession message, because if we weren't worrying about a recession, and what's so interesting, I don't think it's a surprise to anybody at this point that we might have a recession. I mean, let's face it, we have these markets and bear markets. They're forecasting tools. One of the markets, I think maybe the transports or the stocks went into a bear market months and months ago. So the idea that we have this bearish action now, not such a surprise. And a piece of it, of course, is the inflation that we're seeing with gas and fuel. And interesting, the higher that gas and fuel goes, the lower the approval rating for President Joe Biden, not surprisingly. But it's really, just so many uncertain factors to deal with, and especially, for the Fed, too.
Well, we're not doing this alone. We have the ECB trying to really grapple with inflation. We have the Bank of England, and who knows what the Bank of Japan is up to. When you talk about the FX market and the weakening of the dollar after it had been so strong, how much of that is what other people are doing rather than what we're doing?
Well, that's certainly a big piece of it, and that's been the case for, since I've been watching the markets. It's very interesting when you watch these central banks together. It's almost like watching a seesaw or ping pong, and they both take the turn of letting their currency go down. Now, right now, the ECB is saying they have a plan for a plan, especially as they have had sovereign yields and spreads really blow out much wider than folks wanted them. So that's definitely a piece of it. The BOE raised by 25 bips. Let's see what the Bank of Japan does do. But right now, I would say that the Fed is the main player. I mean, we have this historic rate hike. I mean, put it this way. The bond markets are so volatile that the 2-year yield going into this meeting over 5 days up 70 basis points. Yesterday, the biggest drop in yield going back to the financial crisis, 23 basis points. That's how wrong, for lack of a better way, or how aggressive bond traders were into the meeting and now reassessing after Powell said we're not going to be 75 basis point hikes time after time.
But in fairness to bond traders, I'm not sure how much we can be concerned about them, but the Fed has been all over the place.
They have.
So I'm not sure if I were a bond trader, I'd know where we're going because they're changing.
Yeah, a lot of messaging. Although the interesting thing is if you watch the bonds themselves, and we talked about this last year, the yield curve late last year, it was starting to show signs that it could invert. Now, not a lot of attention was being paid to that, but it was almost like bond traders weren't listening to the Fed because yields were kind of staying put as the 2-year yield was starting to creep up. Lo and behold, we had that inversion in April. We had it again yet briefly. But yeah, lots of mixed messaging. But that could be a tool of the Fed also, the element of surprise.
Well, let's talk about those tools of the Fed, because we heard from Jay Powell, the chair, yesterday, who said he has the tools he needs. I wonder if everybody believes him. This is part of what he had to say.
We at the Fed understand the hardship that high inflation is causing. We're strongly committed to bringing inflation back down, and we're moving expeditiously to do so. We have both the tools we need and the resolve that it will take to restore price stability on behalf of American families and businesses.
So there you have it, Abigail. We have the tools we need. Do they?
So this is the multi-trillion-dollar question. And this also goes back to something I was saying the other day. Months ago, I said the Fed doesn't make mistakes. And the reason I said that is in the moment of when the Fed is implementing whatever policy it happens to be, QE or the twist or coming back in, it feels very painful for markets. But then months later, the financial markets haven't crashed. The economy hasn't crashed. Everything keeps going. And investors seem to meet the Fed. The question is, will that happen this time? We simply don't know. What is interesting, I'm looking at WERP, and it does seem like the market is coming into the Fed just slightly because ahead of that meeting, the rate for next February, it had been closer to 4%. Now it's 3.75. The question is it going to come in a little bit? But this sort of rocking the car out of the ditch by some of these mixed messages, time will tell. We'll see.
I like that analogy, rocking the car out of the ditch. Thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle for that report on the markets and their reaction to what we heard yesterday from the Federal Reserve. Now let's turn to an economist for his take on exactly where we are. That's Joachim Fels. He's PIMCO Global Economic Advisor. So thank you so much, Joachim, for being with us. The task of the Fed was to develop a credible plan to attack inflation. Did they do that yesterday?
I think they made a big step towards it. I mean, it took a long time, but I think it's now very clear that inflation is the Fed's enemy number one, number two, and number three. I think they made very clear that they will shoot at inflation first and then worry about growth and unemployment later. I think they acknowledged this for the first time in their summary economic projections because they revised down the growth forecast quite substantially. Not enough in our view, but they're now much more realistic in terms of expecting much lower growth. They're also now projecting rising unemployment over the next couple of years. And so this is like, acknowledging that fighting inflation comes at a cost. And the cost may well be a recession over the next year or two.
I'm so glad you went to the summary of economic projections. I wanted to ask you about that because one of the things that stood out to me, at least, was they have the projections for the core PCE going from 4.3 to 2.7 over the course of a year. That's a big cut in that. At the same time, unemployment only goes up from 3.7 to 3.9. Is that doable? Can you get that much inflation out without doing more damage to the labor market?
Well, it's tough to get inflation down that much with, the kind of rate hikes they are projecting. But I think what's implicit in these projections is that they still view a significant part of the high inflation as supply-induced. And so if, and that's a big if, of course, but if some of those supply distortions ease over the next year, then you can get inflation down without having, to raise rates much more aggressively. So it's a supply and demand story. Some of the inflation we are seeing, maybe even the bulk of it, is supply induced. So again, it's all a question of whether these bottlenecks on the supply side will ease or not, and particularly also what will happen to energy prices.
And on the supply issue there, we've been hearing this from the Fed for quite a while now, that we expect those to ease up. They haven't yet. And as Jay Powell, the chair, said yesterday, a lot of it's not in their power. It's things like the war that Russia is waging in Ukraine. It's things like shutdowns in China. And that's understandable. It's not their fault. At the same time after time, their predictions of the supply easing up have proven to be false. I mean, why should we believe them this time?
Yeah, no, you're right, David. I think the outlook for inflation is extremely uncertain. I think the baseline outlook that they paint and the baseline outlook that is priced into markets, namely that inflation comes down, is only one of many potential outcomes. So I think the Fed is really focused on making sure that the high current inflation, which is largely supply-induced, that it doesn't feed into inflation expectations. And that's where their reaction comes in. Obviously, they cannot do much to influence energy prices. They cannot do much in terms of monetary policy to influence supply chain disruptions. But what they can do is to try and ensure that this doesn't feed into inflation expectations. And I think they changed tune this week, going 75 for the first time in 28 years, mainly because we not only had a high CPI last Friday, but also because inflation expectations on some of those survey measures, like University of Michigan, the 5 to 10 year ahead inflation expectations, that also moved higher. So there were some signs of some unanchoring of inflation expectations. And when that happens, that's when central banks have to take unusual measures like the 75 basis points yesterday. And it also means that, depending on where inflation expectations go from here over the next couple of months, they may actually have to accelerate the pace of tightening and do even bigger steps in the meetings ahead.
Well, to pick up on that, Joachim, I thought we heard actually Chair Powell specifically address the expectations in the University of Michigan survey. As he talked about, they were surprised at those expectations coming in so high. But I wonder, are they figuring in the momentum in the economy, at least from two sources? One is the tightness of the job market, which doesn't seem to be rising anytime soon. And the second one is how much money consumers still have in their bank accounts to spend.
Yeah, I think that adds to the uncertainty in the outlook. I mean, I think if you look at consumer confidence, it is almost at record lows on some measures. So we've seen retail sales falling. So you're seeing signs of weaker spending. You're seeing signs that the high inflation is eating into not only real incomes, but also spending. But then on the other hand, there should be some cushion from the excess savings. They are banking on that this will help prevent a recession. But I think they're walking a very fine line here. All these excess savings may just not be spent in an environment where companies are starting to shed labor and where inflation is really high and people worry about what this means for their future standard of living. So I think the recession risk is really elevated now. I think it's probably even now more likely than not that we see some kind of recession, probably a mild one, over the next year or so. And I think the message from the Fed is, that's not what they want. They obviously want a soft landing, but they're willing to take the risk of a recession because inflation is just too high at more than 8%.
Yeah, which may be what the markets are really getting their arms around today. Thank you so much, Joachim, for being with us. That's Joachim Fels of PIMCO. Coming up, we talk with Senator Todd Young of Indiana about a busy week ahead as Congress gets ready for the 4th of July break. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, Washington is getting ready for that July 4th break coming up, but it has a lot of work to do up on Capitol Hill between now and then with some major legislation they're trying to push through. To take us through that agenda, we welcome now Republican Senator Todd Young of Indiana, who sits in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator, thanks so much for being with us. Before we get to that agenda, let's just spend 1 minute on Ukraine, because you are on the Foreign Relations Committee. You are yourself a veteran of the Marine Corps. So give us a sense of where we are. We hear from General Milley that it's really tough for the Ukrainians right now. They are outmatched in terms of weaponry, and I understand there's another $1 billion headed their way.
Well, it took a bit of time, David, but I will say that the administration has been sending all kinds of weaponry in the wake of a $40 billion spending package to Ukraine passed by Congress. And we need to and will, of course, continue to provide weapons to the Ukrainians. But I would really emphasize that it's time for our allies to continue to dig deep and understand that we are extended all over the world. Our military is needed to watch Iran, to park ourselves in the Asia Pacific and ensure that the Chinese don't continue to grab more territory. So it's time for the allies to increasingly assume more responsibility there, to apply leverage against the Russians and hopefully drive this to a negotiated settlement at some point in coming months.
Thank you so much for that. It's really helpful. Let's turn now to that legislative agenda. And there are at least a couple of major pieces of legislation that I'm aware of. One is the so-called USICA, I think it's U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. It comes out of the CHIPS Act in part. And also there's some gun legislation pending. On the USICA, it's in conference committee. There's a version from the House that goes much farther than the one from the Senate. What are the odds that you're going to come to terms with the two houses and get some legislation to the president next week?
Well, I think it's going to happen, but negotiations are ongoing. We passed that legislation, the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, out of the U.S. Senate with roughly 70 votes a year ago. So it's hard to get a bipartisan vote like that, but we worked hard at it. And essentially what we're trying to do here is make sure that the United States can outcompete and out-innovate the Chinese Communist Party as it relates to national security technologies moving forward. So we increase federal investments in those areas, and there's going to be incredible opportunities for my constituents in Indiana and other Americans around the country to develop and to manufacture these technologies at home. And the other piece of it, which my constituents are very familiar with, is computer chips. There aren't enough of them. Just about anything with an on-off switch requires a computer chip these days, and we are 100% dependent on other countries right now for the manufacture of the highest end computer chips, like the ones that go into our missile system. So there's a real urgency for us to pass this package so that we can reshore the manufacture of these high-end computer chips here in the United States of America.
So it sounds like you think it's going to get through. Is that going to be a lot closer to the Senate version than the House? Because, as I said, my understanding is the House is much broader, covers a lot more, and the Senate really wants it more narrow. Is it going to be closer to your version?
Well, it's going to have to be close to the Senate version. In fact, very closely resemble the Senate version for Republicans to stay on board. You know, in the House, they took, frankly, a pretty partisan approach. You only had one Republican member of Congress who supported that version. So even my Democratic colleagues in the House seem to understand, with a few exceptions, that the final work product will resemble the Senate package if we want to make a law.
And what about the gun legislation? There is bipartisan agreement. As I understand it, they're still negotiating the language. They haven't come to terms on the language yet. Do you anticipate that that may well get through the Congress before the 4th of July break?
Yeah, you know, I'm actually really encouraged, number one, that we have Senator John Cornyn walking point on this negotiation. Like me, he's someone who has consistently earned an A+ rating from the NRA, so he's very concerned about making sure that we ensure our children are protected, that mentally ill people aren't getting their hands on guns if they present a harm to others or to themselves. But at the same time, I think he's the sort of person who can end up with an agreement. So we have a framework right now, and that framework, which would increase resourcing at our school to keep them safe and provide more mental health resources to Americans, among other priorities, is being turned into legislative language. So I haven't had the benefit of looking at that, but I'm going to give it fair consideration in coming days, and I think it has a very good chance of becoming law.
And finally, Senator, obviously a big concern, I think, for every single American right now is inflation and the economy. Now there's talk about a possible recession. Is there anything Congress can do to help on that, or do you have to sit off to the sidelines and watch the Federal Reserve and the administration?
Well, you know, there are things that Congress could do. Congress could repeal some of the onerous regulations that have been imposed or are being threatened against our oil and gas sector. We could seek reassurances from the administration with respect to the future intentions in over-regulating oil and gas so that the price of gas goes down. We can reduce tariff barriers on certain things that are critical inputs to our manufactured goods. So these are all things that I have consistently proposed, but they're frankly inconsistent with the Biden administration's agenda. They don't want to produce more oil and gas here. They've been piling more regulations on top of the existing regulations, and they still continue to press for much higher taxes on our businesses and other individuals as we head into a very challenging inflationary environment for Hoosiers and other Americans.
So, Senator, to summarize sort of what I'm hearing, there are some things that there is some bipartisan support for, such as the USICA coming out of the CHIPS Act, such as some form of gun legislation. But when it comes to the economy, it's awful hard to get bipartisan support. Is there any piece of it you think the Republicans and Democrats could do together? Because, as I say, I think it's probably the #1 concern of a lot of Americans today.
Yeah, the economy absolutely is. Increasingly, I'm hearing, at least behind closed doors and in less public circles from some of my Democratic colleagues, a recognition of the fact that perhaps they've swung too far in their Green New Deal agenda. Perhaps we actually will need oil and gas resources for an extended period of time, and we can slowly transition into a greener energy economy. I think we can agree on energy efficiency measures. I think we probably can agree on paring down some of the regulations that add cost to the things we buy. And if Democratic leadership and the administration would place more emphasis on these things as opposed to what, frankly, I would regard as a more ideological agenda, we could, at least on the margins, bring down prices in the near term.
Okay, thank you so much. Really good to have you back with us. That's Senator Todd Young, Republican of Indiana. Still to come, we're going to go to the other side of the Capitol and Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy for a preview of the January 6th hearings resuming at the top of the hour. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We have a fair amount of action in the markets today in response to the Fed decision yesterday, but also some other central bank action. And to take us through it, we welcome now Kriti Gupta. Kriti, what's going on?
Well, all the green on the screen ahead of yesterday's 75 basis point hikes, well, they've been completely erased, David. And remember, the S&P 500 down 3.3%. But if you look at, say, the NASDAQ or even the Russell 2000, the hit is way, way worse. Russell 2000, for example, down 4.4%. And you can't really blame yields here. Usually when you see a move like this, you see yields skyrocketing, soaring higher on some sort of inflation bet, essentially. And you can't say it's the same thing here. I wonder to what extent the stock market is catching up with the bond market, because as we know, in the lead up to the Fed decision, it was the bond market that was far more volatile. Right now, the 10-year yield only up 4 basis points. On a normal day, that would be a big margin. But given the 20 basis point moves we've seen lately, it's not as bad.
And what about the central banks beyond the Fed? Because we also had the Swissy go up. They've raised their rates for the first time in a long time. A lot of speculation about the Bank of Japan. Yeah,
it's been an interesting week for central banks broadly, and especially if you are a haven currency, for example, or a holder of a haven currency, the Swiss National Bank, the BOJ, both of which have been dealing a lot with, of course, they are the haven currencies of the world, but they're also dealing with the same inflation problems that everyone else is. So the Swiss National Bank came out, hiked rates for the first time in 15 years. We are literally witnessing history here. And remember, the Swiss National Bank is known for kind of their QE. They're known for having a portfolio of even American equities to some extent. They're also known for following the ECB. The fact that they came out ahead of the ECB, hiking 50 basis points, not a small move, that's a big deal for the ECB, which is kind of playing a little bit of catch up, not just to the Federal Reserve, but now to the Swiss National Bank as well. And of course, you mentioned the BOJ as well. That's really the breaking point that a lot of people are watching overnight here. The idea that if the BOJ is dealing with inflation, they also can't hike rates to really tackle it. To what extent is that going to break the JGB market and perhaps unpeg it from that yield curve control that they have? Even a 10 basis point move or even a 1 or 2 basis point move can have ripple effects across the entire world.
Wow, and that's before we get to the pound or the euro.
Exactly.
There's so much to talk about. Thank you so much to Kriti Gupta for taking us through all that. You can catch Kriti again at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Markets. Coming up, the House Select Committee resumes its hearings into the events of January 6th, just over 30 minutes from right now. We're going to talk with one of the committee members, Democrat Stephanie Murphy of Florida. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. To keep up to date with news from all around the world, we turn now to Ritika Gupta here with the first word. Ritika?
Thanks, David. Bloomberg has learned U.S. officials are working to arrange a possible call this summer between President Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping. Tensions are high between the world's two biggest economies. Ukraine, Taiwan, and human rights are amongst the sore points in the U.S.-China relationship, and the two nations have been jockeying for greater influence in the Indo-Pacific region. In Shanghai, residents have to take COVID tests at least once a week until the end of July, with workers at supermarkets, barbers, drugstores, shopping malls, and restaurants required to undergo daily testing. The financial hub reported 16 new cases Wednesday. The drastic measures are part of the government's zero-tolerance approach to the virus that is disrupting the economy and leaving it isolated. Meanwhile, monkeypox is spreading in Africa, including 2 countries where it has not previously been recorded. The World Health Organization is raising concerns after cases were found in at least 8 countries. But the agency says at this point it is not recommending mass vaccination. Next week, the WHO will hold an emergency meeting to assess whether the current spread of monkeypox constitutes a public health emergency. And the New York Times reports that a man has died on the New York City subway after his clothes got trapped in the doors. That caused him to be dragged along the platform and onto the tracks. The incident took place just before midnight yesterday in Brooklyn. Global News 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take. Powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Ritika. Well, at 1 o'clock Eastern Time, just under 30 minutes from right now, the House Select Committee looking into the events of January 6th will resume its hearings. And a short time ago, I talked with one of the members of that committee, Democratic Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy of Florida. We started by talking about the overall case that the Select Committee is putting forward and how today's hearing will fit into that overall case.
The first hearing laid out what you'll be hearing over the next 6 hearings. The second hearing focused on the big lie, the origin of the big lie, which was that President Trump had lost the election, and all of his advisors, his lawyers, had told him he had lost. The Department of Justice was unable to find any evidence of fraud. He had lost, the fraud had not been committed, but he was still telling the American people and his supporters in particular that he had won and that there was still some way he could remain in power. And so in this third hearing, you will start to hear about the pressure campaigns. He pressured people at several different levels, the vice president, the Department of Justice, the state electors, and this one will focus on the pressure campaign against the vice president. That will be the first in a few of these pressure campaign hearings.
As I understand it, there'll be a fair amount of focus on whether the vice president had the ability legally, constitutionally, to do other than he did. How do you hope to establish that, in fact, if in fact there was an issue, it wasn't a close call? That is to say, you know, the law could be very complicated, constitutional law can be very complicated. How do you get around the claim that, you know what, it was just a complicated situation?
I think we'll be able to establish that by providing the evidence through the voices of the advisors around President Trump, just as we have in previous hearings. I think one of the things that makes these hearings so interesting is that the American people are hearing the advice that the president was receiving as he was making these decisions, and then they get to see how he chose to take the advice he was given and what he chose to do with it.
I'm curious, Congresswoman, what, from your point of view, as a member of the Select Committee, what is the ultimate goal? How do you know that you've succeeded? And perhaps more pointedly, is this a political case you're making or a legal case you're making?
I think we are making a case on behalf of democracy. We are speaking to the American people in these hearings. We hope that they will understand how fragile a democracy can be and that they will recommit themselves to helping to sustain our democracy by being informed and educated citizens, by selecting leaders of moral character, and by understanding that our system will only succeed if we're committed to ensuring that it does, and that when your side loses, that doesn't give support for overturning the election process or the constitutional norms.
There's been a fair amount of talk already from the committee, members of the committee, that speaks in the language of, frankly, criminal law, things like conspiracies. Do you anticipate, based on what you know right now, that ultimately there may be a referral to the Department of Justice?
The investigation is still ongoing, and so we haven't gotten to complete our investigation yet. So I think that's a little bit premature to think about that. But I also believe that our committee's purpose and objective is a legislative one. We are supposed to lay out the facts and then provide some legislative recommendations. We're laying out the facts for the American people, and they get to see all of this information and judge for themselves whether or not the President Trump was fit for his office. And then the Department of Justice is also able to take a look at the evidence that we will provide in full with the report, as well as these hearings, and make a decision for themselves as to whether or not there's things that they need to investigate. And I would say that they already are pursuing criminal investigations. As you know, they have prosecuted hundreds of people who were involved with January 6th. So they don't need us to tell them to do something. They are already in the process of investigating and prosecuting people who broke the law.
Much of the case that we've seen so far has been directed very specifically at the former President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. But there are also some implications for, frankly, some of your colleagues up there. We saw that video yesterday of Representative Loudermilk conducting a tour of the Capitol. In watching that, I'm curious, isn't it fairly standard for members of Congress to give their constituents a tour? Is there anything particularly pernicious about that?
The couple of things to point out about that is that at that point in time, we were not doing tours for the public because of the COVID conditions. And so that's one thing. There were no, usually we do tours, we're back to doing tours, but at that time that was a bit unusual. And I think the behavior of the members of that tour group were a little unusual. Usually people don't take photos of stairwells, exit security checkpoints. But that's why we asked Mr. Loudermilk to come in and talk to us. If he has nothing to hide, I think he should be willing to talk to the committee. We're just trying to find all of the relevant facts to what happened in the lead up to January 6th and what happened on January 6th.
Has he responded to your invitation yet?
No, he has not. But there's plenty of time, and we welcome him coming before the committee.
And finally, Congresswoman, I'm curious. There has been some talk about, in the public generally, but specifically of some members of Congress really saying that they think the election was illegitimate. Do you think that one of the effects of this are you seeing it already develop, that fewer and fewer people are questioning at least the legitimacy of the election?
I think what the president and some of our Republican colleagues did in saying that this election was fraudulent, even though there was no evidence of that, has been incredibly damaging to our democracy. I can't imagine in a democracy like this, having elected officials actually undermine the credibility of elections, free and fair elections. I mean, I come from a country where, they have elections, but they're not actually. It's an autocracy. It's not real elections, and I know how pernicious undermining the people's belief that their vote matters can be in a country. And so it's just terribly disappointing behavior here in a very vibrant democracy to see elected officials for their own personal gain so disillusioned among the American people about our election system.
That was Democratic Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy of Florida, a member of the House Select Committee looking into the events of January 6th. Coming up, Democrats have their work cut out for them heading into the midterms. We talk with veteran Democratic strategist Jim Messina about what they need to do. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. This is, of course, a midterm election year, and the Democrats had their work cut out for them before they had some setbacks from the pandemic as well as the economy and inflation. Well, what they need is the expert advice of somebody who has not only advised but successfully advised some very big campaigns, and that would be Jim Messina. He is CEO of the Messina Group. Mr. Messina ran the successful campaign for President Obama's re-election in 2012 and then served as White House Deputy Chief of Staff. So thanks, Jim, so much for being back with us. Let's start with what we were just talking about with Congresswoman Murphy. These January 6th hearings that the House Select Committee are having, is that going to help the Democrats in the midterms?
Well, look, I think we ought to put the politics of that aside for a sec and just say it's incredibly important to see this moment where we almost had stopping of normal change in power. And so we need to make sure that never happens again. So these hearings are important. The interesting thing is the polling numbers on this hearing has really changed. Now, 2/3 of American voters, including 70% of independent voters, say they support the hearings and support looking into this matter. And so it's incredibly important. But Democrats have to walk and chew gum at the same time. They got to focus on these hearings, but they also have to focus on the bread and butter issues that you and I know win elections. And that's always the economy. American voters are economic voters, and Democrats have got to do that. They're facing historic headwinds. The average president's party in a non-presidential year loses 3.5 seats in the Senate over the last 50 years and 28 seats in the House. That's just the averages, David. So when we go into this election, Democrats are already facing really tough historical precedents, and then you layer on a war in the Ukraine and inflation and gas prices. It is a very tough political environment for the president's party.
So, Jim, if it's the economy stupid, to quote from a different successful Democratic presidential campaign, if it's the economy stupid, is there anything you can do about it? If you listen to President Biden, he largely, not entirely, but largely is saying, it's up to the Fed.
Well, look, what voters want to see is all their elected officials focus on this, and they want to see them trying. They need to get caught trying. And so that's why you've seen the White House have Biden travel more. That's why you've seen him talking more about economic issues. If you look at polling, the economy is number one, inflation's number two. And so Biden has to get caught trying, and Democrats have to have a plan to be seen by voters as being very on top of issues that really affect their voters' everyday lives. The interesting thing, though, is now suddenly gun violence is the number 3 issue and abortion is the number 4 issue. And as you know, the Supreme Court's likely to rule in the next week or 10 days on abortion, and that could put guns and abortion into the middle of this election cycle in a way we just haven't seen. So we're sitting here with just a few months left in the elections, but things could really change if abortion and gun rights continue to rise in polling.
Well, and of course, we have that pending legislation with something of an agreement in principle, bipartisan agreement on some gun legislation in the Congress among those senators. If that gets enacted, how does that work for Democrats? Does it take some of the heat out of that issue?
Yeah, it does. And I think voters, especially women voters, who are the key to these elections, want action on gun violence. They've said it over and over and over, and they're incredibly frustrated. And I think both parties would be beneficiaries if they can pass this bill. And it's amazing we're still debating this bill, David, because every single piece of this is supported by over 85% of Americans. And only in Washington, the 10 square mile logic free zone, as I like to call it, is this controversial, because American voters and all parties want this done, and there will be benefits to incumbents who vote for this crucial piece of legislation.
Jim, sometimes the most important things are not necessarily the ones that get the most attention. I'll name 2. We've got a bipartisan infrastructure act. We talked actually yesterday with Mitch Landrieu, who's trying to implement that. A very big deal, and yet I'm not sure Democrats are getting a lot of credit for that right now. And then we have the so-called USICA, the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, that involves things like infrastructure around microchips. Are those things the voters pay any attention to? It may be very important, but I'm not sure if it really registers with voters.
Boy, I'm really frustrated on the infrastructure issue, because this is one that the Democrats should have been able to sell. If you can't sell, cutting ribbons and building new highways and subway stations and everything else, you're just terrible at politics. But the Democrats haven't really sold it, and it's incredibly frustrating. When you're talking about the chip bill, it's really interesting. There's only a couple issues that really unite both parties right now, and one of them is China and kind of opposition to China and wanting America to get their own house in order. And that's why this bill is likely going to pass. It's really important funding to get our computer chip manufacturing industry to have our own ability and not be so reliant on the Chinese and Taiwan. I think that's going to pass, and it's going to get done relatively quickly. And I think it's important, but I don't think voters are focused on it. I haven't seen any ability for voters to sort of say that's an important issue, even though you and I both know it's crucial legislation that has bipartisanship in a really time where we don't have very much of that.
Jim, finally, there's a lot of speculation already about 2024 and what the Democrats will do, whether, in fact, President Biden should run again. He said he's running. We talked with Jim Clyburn in South Carolina earlier this week. He said he thinks he should run. But if you were advising the Democratic Party, how should they go about even thinking about the question of who their best nominee is in 2024?
Well, look, I think it's clear the president's running. You and I can't remember a historical precedent when the sitting president doesn't run for re-election. And having spent 40 years wanting to be president, I would be very surprised if Biden doesn't run. That said, it's the favor parlor game in Washington right now about everyone who thinks they're running or could run if the president steps down. I've already had over 20 people meet with me and talk about running for president, just kind of, curious on the process. And so both parties are starting to gear up, but I think it's a silly exercise on my side of the aisle because I think it's clear the president's running.
So let me ask a broader question if I could. And I know this is a delicate question, but I'm mindful of my own age, so I think maybe I have license to do this. What about age? And I'm not just talking about President Biden. I'm talking about the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. I'm talking about Mitch McConnell. I'm talking about Donald Trump himself. We have an awful lot of people who are either octogenarians or pushing octogenarian. At what point do we need to really think about how young you should be to have some of these very difficult jobs?
Well, it's a great question because the Democratic leadership in the House, all three major positions are filled by people over 75 years old. And so there's lots of people talking about who are these next generation of leaders on both sides. And it's incumbent on both parties to continue to develop these next generation leaders. I mean, you just had right before me Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy, who I think is one of the smartest politicians in America, and I think should run for bigger office. And, I could see her on a presidential ticket someday, and another young leader. We got to find more leaders like that because, sooner or later, these folks who currently lead are going to step away, and we've got to have a new generation of leaders who can help this country move forward.
Jim, it's always such a treat to have you with us. Really appreciate it. That's Jim Messina. He's founder and CEO of the Messina Group. Coming up, we go to the West Coast and get a report on Elon Musk's first appearance before Twitter employees. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. You may have heard that Elon Musk has made an offer, is actually committed to buy Twitter. And perhaps as part of that process, he is right now addressing Twitter employees out of the West Coast. And we turn now to our colleague, Ed Ludlow, who has been live blocking. You can go on T-Live and follow exactly what's going on in this meeting, which is fascinating. Ed, thanks so much for being with us. Before we get to the larger political issues, what about Twitter itself? Has he confirmed he's actually going to go through with the deal?
So that's the only sentence missing. He has not uttered the words, "I am committed to the deal," but he's given a lot of insight into what the company would look like under him. He's very focused on the issue of bots and spam on the platform. And one concrete proposal that he made was that you and I, Twitter users, David, we would pay for the right to verify that we are who we say we are. He talked a lot about remote work and work from home, saying that only the most, quote, excellent contributors should be allowed to work from home or remotely. Otherwise, he expects them to come in the office. They asked him, would he be CEO if the deal goes through? And he said, I'm not hung up on the title. I just want to drive product changes on the platform. And, there's a lot coming out, but one that stuck out to me was he has a goal of setting Twitter's user base at 1 billion active users, which seems very distant from where the company is right now.
Well, okay, he wants to really have influence over the product. What about having influence over the revenue? Have we got any indication about whether we would have some subscription dollars coming in or maybe even give up some of the advertising?
Yeah, Musk was pretty detailed about this. Sources say that he said advertising is important, and he sees a world where Twitter could be a dual model, right? A subscription-based model like he's floated before, and an advertising-based model. And he said both are equally important, but he also added both make him equally concerned about bots. He's really hung up on this idea on bots and spam. He said ultimately, whatever the revenue stream is, revenue needs to be higher than costs, which is a pretty prudent position to take. But he also said that he wants to make the platform too expensive for bots. In other words, that some kind of payment is required for use to disincentivize anyone that would run an active bot account. And
who's he favoring in terms of the presidential election? Because I think didn't he tweet out earlier that he liked Ron DeSantis from Florida?
He did tweet, exactly. In the last 24 hours, he said he's leaning towards Ron DeSantis for 2024. He basically said that his politics are moderate and he's in the center. He didn't name any names, really, but what Musk said was he wants anyone to be able to go on the platform, on Twitter, even, quote, with extreme views, as long as those, quote, extreme views are within the parameters of the law. So he's talking about freedom of speech and opening up Twitter to a diverse range of political arms. But he said that his politics is in the center, or near to the center is the words that he used.
Yeah, I'll be curious to see whether Governor DeSantis likes being called a moderate. I'm not sure that he thinks of himself that way. Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow. Again, you can go on T-Live and follow this throughout the meeting. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter now on the terminal and online. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we'll talk to former HP CEO Carly Fiorina about all that talk about windfall profits tax on oil companies. This is Balance of Power, and we are on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio.